All right. Thank you, everyone, for joining us here at Artspace for this fresh curators conversation. My name is Michael S. Williams, and I'm an independent curator in North Carolina, and I'll be moderating this discussion with Artspace and the curators behind Fresh. Now, Fresh is a biannual exhibition that features specifically North Carolina artists. Now, due to COVID-19, the exhibition has gone online, and it features more than 250 works. Artspace asks special curators to come in and choose from those works and pick their own online galleries. And we'll talk to some of those curators in just a moment. But first, let's meet and chat with Annah Lee, Artspace's Director of Artistic Programs. Annah Lee, how you doing?
I'm doing great, Mike. Thank you so much for facilitating the conversation today.
No problem. Thank you for doing it. So Fresh seems to always present a wide variety of artists and mediums. What's the history of this biannual exhibition?
The Fresh came about 6 years ago. It was the brainchild of my predecessor, Shana Dumont-Gar, who was the previous director of exhibitions and residencies at Artspace. She has since moved up to the Boston area and is doing great work up there. But for her, she really wanted to start a exhibition that could, one, function as a fundraiser for Artspace, so that is a key component of it, but also one that worked to sort of take away the mystery behind juried shows. So she'd seen many juried shows with sending out rejections to the large pool of artists who've submitted, and then presenting this very limited body of work. And so she thought that it could be really interesting to find a way to display all submitted works to the public, and then from that bring in a guest curator who then juries the show into its sort of complete juried form. And the idea being that it's not just demystifying the process, but it's really allowing the viewer to be a part of the process and to sort of play the role of curator in their own mind. Like when you're looking at 200 plus bodies of pieces of work, as is evidenced by the selections that our panelists today have put together, there are multiple strong shows that could come from that, depending on what ideas you're hoping to convey as a curator, etc. So we, as you'd mentioned, put this show on every 2 years. It's grown every year. I was a little heartbroken when we had to move it online this year, but honestly, it's in some ways been even more interactive this way, more accessible to more people. I think I know we've had more sales than ever before through it, and more people, commenting and engaging with the social media posts we've done around it. So,
yeah, that's interesting. You mentioned, the pivot that had to be made because of COVID-19. So, briefly, how challenging was it for you to take this massive exhibition and put it online?
For me personally, it wasn't very challenging at all, because everyone knows I'm totally inept with technology, so I didn't have to figure any of that out. So at first it seemed incredibly daunting and terrifying, but we have such an incredible staff who was just ready to go in and make it happen. I don't know if people are aware of this. I certainly wasn't. Google Sites is what we've used as the platform for Fresh, and it's been incredibly user friendly, even for someone like me. There's a whole back end of getting things into a point of sale system so that we can facilitate sales. But in terms of my ability to then arrange the works of art on a web page, it's incredibly easy in some ways. And then again, to then create these curated pages outside of that, it really hasn't been nearly as disappointing or scary as I'd thought it might be.
Well, that's good. Let's meet our guest curators then. We have Leah Newman, who's the director and curator of Van Every Smith Galleries at Davidson College. Rafael Osuba, artistic director of Artist Studio Project in the El Quixote Festival, North Carolina. Alexys Taylor, former exhibition and collections manager of the Harvey B. Gantt Center for African American Arts and Culture, and Susan Tollefsen, a local interior designer. How's everyone doing today?
Great.
Great.
Doing well.
Thanks for having us.
Awesome. Thank you all for joining in this conversation. So I want to get it started, and this is for everyone, and we'll start with you, Leah. What was your approach in taking on this task? I mean, did you have to deviate from your usual approach in curating a show, and how did you go through the more than 250 submissions?
So actually, in terms of curating, it was a little bit different, but in terms of jurying, this is really the way that jurying happens now, right? Like online, using some sort of online platform. So we've really gotten used to trying to understand works of art, which, as we all know, as people that want to be in front of real works and immersed in exhibitions, it's different, obviously, to look at things online, but it's really the way that so much jurying, grant panels, residencies, all of this happens online now. So that, I think, wasn't really problematic, right, to look at the works in that format. I did think about it as like a curatorial selection, which I think is, in terms of thinking about a theme, which is different than I maybe would approach a regular juried exhibition. In a juried exhibition, I would kind of look at each work individually and just on the merit of that work. And although like it's hard as a curator to sometimes not think about it as like a selected curatorial theme, I really try not to do that, right? Like, so that way every single artist has a fair shake at being in the exhibition in a regular juried show. But I think in this way, like thinking about a little curatorial selection and knowing that it wouldn't be the only pool of works, that there were four other curators to also make little selections, I did think more about like a curatorial theme. And I was thinking, and I think so many of us probably were thinking about like social distancing or physical distancing as the wording we're supposed to use now. And just thinking about being in isolation and anxiety and sort of this unknown. I felt like there were a lot of works that spoke to that, or maybe I was reading that into the works. I don't know.
Yeah, I think when you go through, more than 250, there's probably a dozen themes that I myself could have pulled out. So it's kind of it's a fun task, but it could be a daunting task. Now, Rafael, you mentioned in your statement that it's times like these that artists find answers to what they're looking for, or find answers to the things that are going on. So when you were going through these, Rafael, what were you looking for?
Well, first of all, thanks again for having me on. And it's been fun doing this. It's been a good distraction, right? To take me away from what I'm working on to kind of work on this and get a fresh project. But when I curate the works that I do, they're usually, I'm trying to tell a story. So they are theme-based. I mean, the vast majority. So this was really easy for me in the sense that it felt comfortable because it's the way that I approach, the way that I curate my works. Every once in a while, we'll do we'll feature the one artist, but typically the shows that I do are curated by, we have a theme, there's a call that goes out, and then we decide who's gonna participate based on those criteria. For me, when I looked at the works, because I always try to tell a story, I think the biggest story that we want to tell is what we're going through right now, right? I felt like we're all closed in. We have this issue of the coronavirus that, that's the elephant in the room. And because personally, I was going through some issues, and as everyone has, I try to find a way that I can tell that story based on the images that were presented in front of me. It's always tough to do things online because you don't get to really see texture, and you're not able to see really appreciate the size and the scope and the fine details. But For me, I approach it from the storytelling of a poem. I think that artists during these crises, and when I mean artists, I mean all artists, whether they be visual artists, whether they be poets, literature, cinema, they have an ability to speak to truth. While a lot of times there's stuff that's going on later on when we go look back in time in history, we find that it's the artists that really have the ability to tell us what was happening during that time. And it's a great crisis has a great way of giving good material to artists. So it's a great time to really tell stories, to share what is happening in our community. And I particularly found it interesting that a lot of the works that were submitted spoke to what I was seeing in my community or what I was feeling. And so it became very easy for me to try to tell that story of what was happening now, which is, this distancing, this crisis that we're going through, the changes that we have here in our community, the way that we do our work, the way that we interact with our family and friends. And so, yeah, so I used this wonderful poem that Kitty O'Meara had written that went viral, and I thought that it spoke clearly what I wanted to express in telling the story that I wanted to tell, utilizing these images.
Yeah, I like your statement about how crisis is when we can really, really begin to unpack and then tell stories. It makes me think about the Harlem Renaissance period and all of these times through history where we've had these things going on, and artists and creatives are the ones that get us through. And so I hope when we get through this, people will remember the artists and the creatives who helped us get through. Now, Susan, being an interior designer, you may be drawn to the visual aspects more than anything, right? So talk about your approach to choosing your pieces.
It was all about what I liked. You guys are so brilliant. I'm sitting here going, why am I here? Oh my God. I don't know a whole lot about art or art history, I just know what I like. So that's kind of where I went with finding the ones I liked, the colors, the subjects, I looked at some of what they said after I picked what I liked, and their comments of why they did what they did or what their inspiration was, and it didn't matter. Everything I picked, it was just because it was interesting to me.
Yeah, I think that sometimes the art world is so academic in a way that it might take away from some people who are just entering. And so sometimes it is just about what one likes versus what one doesn't like. But then once you get in and you start to read what the work is about and you start to unpack that way, you have a whole different perspective. And so I think sometimes we should respect where people are as they're coming into the art. Now, Alexys, in your statement, you mentioned that you like to visualize art in person and then be drawn to the story. So kind of a different approach than Susan. So how did this process for you choosing the works online affect to how you were drawn to the stories?
Well, I definitely did this from, very different than I would have approached doing a show in person. So I really didn't have the theme, which I would usually have, try to find a theme and all these other things. I decided to look at so many different elements of it, whether that was the visual, like how was I drawn to it visually, more of a personal effect, does it strike a memory for me? Is the art telling a story from what I could tell? And then I did even look at some of the statements as well, because I love when artists can write statements that didn't determine whether I chose it or not, but all of this kind of holistically putting it together. And for me, taking away the theme, trying hard to mindfully understand, like, okay, I don't want to do a theme. I actually just kind of want to approach this from a very holistic standpoint. So it was very different for me, but I enjoy it. And I love what Susan mentioned, because working in the museum field and having the opportunity to whether curate a show or work with so many amazing curators and artists, I also had the opportunity when I first started in the museum to work as a guest services associate. And I was responsible for giving so many tours to a variety of different age groups. And while doing that, you really can tie in the elements. Okay, here's a curatorial standpoint, but how do people really take it all in, right? We really want to work for our community and the people who walk through our doors. So how can they interpret the art? How can they break down the museum walls, which museums been doing this for centuries, trying to break down this museum wall to make sure people can feel welcome walking through. And so by doing that, right, you do add in some art historical references, but there's times where you look at the art and I will ask someone, what colors do you see? What do you think about when you think of this? My favorite thing is picking out a color. What do you think about when you think of the color red? I get people saying death or love or passion. And I always tell this story because my favorite response was this 5-year-old kid who said it reminded me of the ketchup I had on my fries for lunch, right? So there's so many different interpretations. And for me, having the academic background, interpreting that, but also, of course, personal, but then also thinking about who is this serving? What are people seeing? Who is our audience? And just allowing people to understand that art is for everyone.
Yeah, I so love that anecdote about the little boy being reminded of the ketchup, because sometimes that's a person's entry point, right? And so now that we got them, let's add on the different layers, right? And I wish that we could, I wish more spaces would take that approach more often, because especially in these times, like Rafael mentioned, we're all isolated. And so, we're wanting each other, we're wanting human connection. And so when we're able to be back together, I hope that we're able to do that. I want to jump to some of the works that each of you chose. Yeah, so here, Leah, we've got two of the works that you chose. We've got Susan Martin's Burn Pile, and of course, work by Antoine Williams. Talk about these pieces and sort of what you saw when you were going through it and picking out these two.
And before I even talk about these works, I do think that it is worth mentioning, again, that the overall pool that we looked at, submissions, non-curated, was pretty amazing, I have to say. Like, there were some amazing works. It was a struggle. I think I went over the number of works that we had said we should pick, because it was actually really hard to pick. I think the quality was really, really high. I like that you picked these two because for me to talk about, because I know both of these artists really well. And I think they both have in their work created a really strong visual language that is really recognizable. So without looking at the names, and I tried to do that as much as possible when jurying, just look at the images and respond first sort of by gut and then thinking about this theme. But I recognize these artists' works right away because I think they've done such an amazing job of creating a recognizable language, visual language, that they've been working on for a long time, but have also continued to evolve and develop and grow that visual language. Susan's work, I've just always really loved her sort of like sensitivity to drawing, these beautiful prints where often each one is slightly different. The etching part is the same, but then she goes in with watercolor and other media so that they each become a unique work. And that sort of precarity that's represented, this idea of the burn pile. I don't know, for me, I just thought about this idea of like burn it all down and start over, which felt like this moment that I'm in, or that we're all in.
So that's a real feeling though, right? Like, we wake up, and so that's why I was drawn to this one out of your picks too, is because we wake up and we say, well, how do we start over? How do we flatten everything and just start over?
Yeah, I wish I knew the right answer for that too. But yeah, so this idea of like debris, detritus, I think there's some, realistic things like thinking about a burn pile, but then sort of the conceptual idea of this. Just loved that. And then for Antoine, this is a work for sure that I wish I could see in person, because I know both physically, like process wise, it's full of layers. and then conceptually as well. And I want to be able to read all of that text and figure out what he's trying to obscure and what he's trying to reveal. But he's often making really incredible works that are conceptually can be challenging, about race and masculinity. So I was drawn to both of these works, thinking about the moment that we're in, not just with the pandemic, but sort of politically and socially.
Yeah, I'm always fascinated by, I'm very familiar with Antoine's work, and always fascinated by a lot of his choices aesthetically, and I'm very, very drawn to him. So I thought that these two were really great additions. Now, Rafael, again, the choices you picked are sort of a current state of the times kind of thing. We've got Nicole Drake's Quietude and then Rachel Wexler's Rust Pieces on Paper. Talk about these and how they mirror the time.
Well, for me, these are two good examples. I was happy they chose them because when you read my statement, or when you read the theme that I was going for, it was really dealing with what's happening now. This quiet time, this distancing, this part of a being isolated. Obviously, it's a somber time of death and things of that nature. And so, for instance, Nicole's piece. When I saw that piece, immediately I thought of a tomb. I thought of, a place that just was kind of a somber place, and a lot of us have been dealing with that. I personally have had family members that have passed away during this time, and so that and then her choice of the name of it really stood out for me, because it's a Spanish name, quietud, so which means quiet, which means stillness, and it just, I think that her color choices were fantastic, and I wish that I would see this piece in person, because I bet you that it's even more fabulous in person. But I really wanted to utilize this piece in the storytelling of this quiet place and what happens. And I see a lot in this piece. So I felt that it was a good piece that you selected of some of the choices. As far as Miss Wexler's piece, I love this piece. I know that the size isn't very large, but the fact that the pieces look like how we're going to be sitting in theaters, or it's like social distancing. At the same time, it's I see it as a bird's eye view of figures that are still, that are stagnant, that don't move. And what happens with vehicles and places and buildings that are not being used? They become rusted. And so I saw that in this storytelling and in her piece, and it screamed what we're doing, what's happening right now, and I felt that it was appropriate to include in the group that I selected.
Yeah, you know what? The idea about art imitating life happens in so many different ways, and a personal anecdote: a vehicle that I drive hadn't been driven in 8 weeks because the stay-at-home orders, and the battery was dead, right? Like, so thinking about Rachel's piece specifically, it really hits home in so many different ways, and so appreciate those selections. Now Alexys, Clarence Hayward's work and Kiki Farish's work on the surface look like there's just a huge juxtaposition there. But when you really break them down, there's probably more similarities than people think. So talk about your selection.
Absolutely. Same thing what, even Leah said, mentioned earlier, the submissions were absolutely incredible. I was just prideful of so many artists being North Carolina bound. It was just a great show. So I'm glad you chose these two, because this is such a great example of, even if I was walking someone through an exhibit or a tour, I would love to put these two together, because again, let's go ahead and judge from the surface of it. So of course I was, for Clarence, I was drawn to it because of the figure, because of the symbolism, because of the American flag, right? It's so many things that are going on now. But for me personally, this has been a very much lifelong thing of being Black in America, that really trying to balance off of being so prideful of being American, having my whole entire family serve in the military, mother, father, grandfather, everyone served in the military, living on a military base before moving to North Carolina. That was a sense of pride for me. So that American flag was like, you know, this is something prideful. And, you know, as you get older and your eyes open up more and things becoming more aware, and, you know, you just have this really, you kind of heart kind of breaks, because now sometimes even if I'm driving through, I see an American flag, I kind of worry about, oh man, is there a Confederate flag right next to it? It's very interesting when you're kind of doing that, because now you see the American flag as something, maybe the symbolism is changing a little bit for somebody personally, but it's just so many things that I'm going back and forth with my personal experience, what's going on now, and being Black in America. The title of it, The Shelter, really drew me too, because it's, you know, the Black boy is behind the American flag, and it is, this country is supposed to give us so much protection, but yet, you know, we're so vulnerable in here. We know the recent death just happening with a young gentleman, young Black man who was murdered, right, running outside of the street. This is something I deal with daily. I have my young nephews here. There's 10 and 7. I constantly have to like think about, man, they're going outside. Don't put a hoodie on. Don't put your hand in your pocket. You know, dating a Black male constantly. He's 6'5" nonetheless, right? So he's a huge Black male walking down the street and constantly worrying about these things. As humans, we worry about the safety of our loved ones, but you have to recognize the additional layer for those who've been oppressed for so many years. And that category comes in many different things. So if we go over to Kiki's image, I love this image because it just reminded me of, like, it's very calming yet very disturbing as well. I didn't know what to feel. My emotions were kind of all over the place with this piece, just because the poppy seed itself and what like the poppy flower represents, right? The sleeping and death. Like I already knew that right away when I saw the poppy. And in this picture, you may not see it, but there's a tiny hint of red as well. So it's not completely red poppy flower. So I was so very much just emotionally all over the place with this piece. And then realizing that the flower is so feminine, right? It's very feminine, strong, beautiful thing, very sensual too, but also looking at just feminism in general, being a woman, right? In this country, being a woman around this world adds so many different layers, right? We have to have this strength, and yet sometimes we're just constantly pushed down. For these two things, both of these images represent who I am, being a Black woman, right? In this world and in this country. These are two things I can't hide from, right? Sometimes you can look at someone and say, I don't know what economic status they have, right? But when you look at me, I cannot hide my skin color, and I can't hide who I am as a female. These are things I can never hide anywhere I go to. So when I'm in a room, I do have to think about these things always. And personally, coming from a Black institution, and now I'm actually in a new organization where it's a very white institution, I constantly think about these things all the time. So for these two hit personally, it hit home for me. They're so similar in ways of just realizing that, you know, you really have to go through a lot of things as being a Black male, as being a female, and just the beauty of it, just such emotional. It was so emotional, these pieces. It had me so confused and loving it at the same time, and kind of all over the place. And these two were just one of my favorites of the show.
Yeah, I so appreciate your comments. I mean, you spoke to a lot of things. For me, the overarching theme of it is the beauty and the power of art to help us understand and unpack and deal with these times that we're in, specifically now. The juxtaposition of the flag with the boy, and the flowers are supposed to be these pretty things that give us comfort, but yet it's the poppy flower. Seemingly there's this juxtaposition like I mentioned, but there are some very, very evident overlapping themes, and you hit on a whole bunch of them, and we'll have to have a separate conversation where we get into that.
It's not enough time.
Now, Susan, transitioning a little bit, the colors here in the works that you chose from Megan West on the left, and then Adam Vester. Talk about these pieces and sort of what you saw, and how you maybe visualize them and incorporating them into the work that you do?
Megan's piece was just, I love the black, the white, the red. It was crisp. It was kind of scary. I kind of imagined myself laying on the sofa, falling off of it. So I don't know, which makes no sense. I think it's an easy placement for me in art. I have a lot of clients that are scared to death of art, and I try to ease their mind. I'm like, it's nothing. You like it, you don't like it. That's all for you. That's all you need. And then you can get deeper if you want, or you don't. But anyway, I just thought it was crisp and interesting and scary and all those things.
Again, these different entry points into art that we have, right? Like, we're not, you don't have to be a scholar to necessarily begin and understand. And I think that having this diversity of the backgrounds in this conversation helps us with that. So I want to kick it to Anna. Talk about what you saw in everybody's selections and how you think the galleries are different and maybe some of the similarities.
What did I see in the selections? I mean, it was exciting for me because in some ways it's when you're asking someone to make choices, inevitably there's the personal comes through. So it's a means of sort of getting to know somebody a little bit more in some ways, whether it's through their aesthetic taste or the sort of conversations and stories that they're drawn to and trying to pull. So I mean, there was that for me that I noticed and found really interesting because, it's not just the artwork that's telling the stories or the artist. When you're talking about a curator or a juror, it's also their story. So that was interesting to see. It was very interesting to see the repeats. I mean, there are pieces like Antoine's, Susan's, Clarence's piece. I think Adam Vester's piece that you'd selected, Susan and Rafael. It was interesting to see which one sort of repeated across the jurors. I don't know that there was any one piece that made an appearance in all of our selections, but there were certainly some that made an appearance in 3 or 4. So, and then you start to think when that happens, of course, there's just the artistic merit of the piece. There were, as it's been stated, really astounding works that just exist as strong examples of art. But you also start to pick up, I think, as you see that repetition across, some of the overarching stories. So I mean, things like Rafael was hinting on. I mean, I think all of you have actually. But the climate we're in, beyond just COVID-19 and social distancing, thinking about things like race, about identity, about loss, just sort of things that we all deal with in our culture started popping up. And that was cool. So, yeah.
Yeah, I love hearing everybody talk about the work, and then I love looking at everybody's selections. I think everybody chose at least 19 selections, and so to be able to, I wish I could put them all, the images in a spreadsheet, and that's how I'm able to visualize things. Leah, I saw you taking notes, and so I know that you have lots of thoughts about some of the choices that people made. So what did you see in everybody else's picks?
Well, one thing I was going to say, when Susan's 2 choices were on the screen at the same time, I don't know if anyone else saw this, probably not in person, but at that scale where they were both the same scale, they were 2 line drawings that almost looked identical. It was like 2 figures, right? So I think looking at everyone's selections helped me see things in the works that I didn't see before, or tell different kinds of stories, like the order of the works, and that's really what we do as curators, right? Is we try to tell stories and help people see things in new ways. And so looking at everyone's selections, I think really just helped me look a little bit closer at the works. And there were works I was like, oh, how did I not put that one in? Or did I miss that? What, where did that come from? So just being able to see it in a different order on a screen with other things around it. Yeah, so it was fun to kind of see, and it was fun to see where we overlapped for sure.
Yeah, I again enjoy that aspect of it. And it's funny you mentioned the two I put up for Susan, because I noticed that as soon as I put the slide together, I was like, wait a minute, these are eerily similar, and I would have never thought that or noticed that. Susan, when you look at the works that everybody else chose in their separate galleries, what kind of things did you notice from a color perspective, or from a perspective of an interior designer?
I love that you guys thought to have a theme, most of you, and I didn't really. So I don't really know how to curate a show or even juror a show. So it's just interesting to see how you guys put your stuff together. The color, all these pieces were so good that I really had a hard time picking. I don't know. Don't ask me any more questions.
So I think what's interesting is that, and I'm glad, Susan, you're in this, because I think it represents in some ways some of the anxiety, if you will, that people have when they enter the art world. And to Alexis's point, we need to embrace that, because these people can have valid thoughts and opinions too, and we should do that. And so I want to go to you, Alexys, and talk about maybe the future of exhibitions and spaces, right, in the time that we're in, and with and no end in sight as far as ending this and being what it was 4, 5, 6 months ago. Where do you think spaces need to continue to pivot when we come up out of this?
I think it goes to the point of anytime you're under this crisis situation, you realize that things should have kind of been in place. There's a lot of museums who are taking advantage of the digital world. But what I think we need to see more of is constantly having this, more museums doing that, more accessibility, because many people cannot walk through the doors. So this goes back to accessibility. I took a class when I was working on a master's at Johns Hopkins. I did the digital curation class, and I thought that was so fascinating, that class completely, because now, it was in 2015, and just how this professor was really thinking towards the future in 2015 and trying to embed that in the museum. And it takes time and it takes money to do all these things. But what we're realizing is it's not as hard as we're trying to make it. We can do these online exhibitions. We can have more accessibility. We can do more community shows by doing something like we're doing right now with Fresh. There's so many different things that museums need to constantly have in their repertoire, and not just having these physical exhibition spaces, but always thinking about accessibility. And I believe that's the pivot, where not just some museums are doing, or some galleries or local institutions, but I think now you're going to see a jump to around 90-95% of these institutions are going to start doing this because of COVID-19. And so that's why I see museums, I see constantly on my feed of just having panel discussions, right? Doing live art programs on Zoom is so interesting and fascinating. And I think that should continue after we get through this crisis that we're in as well. YouTube series, I know the Gantt Center is doing several YouTube series of what's going on and how it connects to the art world and the Black community and so many different items as well. So I do believe that we're gonna come out of this even stronger, right? I know everyone's been saying that, but I truly believe that for our institutions, it's definitely gonna bring a way to make more people engaged and to make sure that we can, again, break down those museum walls by looking at the tools that we have, such as technology.
Yeah, I agree. And Rafael made the point earlier about what crisis does and how crisis forces you to make necessary changes. Thank you for mentioning the programming the Gantt Center's been doing. I've been watching a few of those, and they've been really great. And I think that what institutions can learn is that, wait a minute, we're a lot more than just art. Anna and I have had a lot of conversations about that over the years, and how can art is our platform, and it's our tool, but we can do more than that. Now, Rafael, and what you're doing, where do you see some of the immediate future, and then some of the couple years down the road where we'll be?
Well, I think that for me, I've been using the digital platforms as a tool. It's been a very effective tool for me with the festival, and it always gives us an opportunity to reach greater audiences, and I think that's great. There's nothing like seeing the work right in front of you. I mean, really, right? I mean, you really want to be able to be to see the work in front of you, so you can really take it in. But you know, this medium gives us an opportunity to give access to individuals that wouldn't normally have access. And to me, that's one of the key reasons why I do the work that I do. Is I want to bring the arts out to the community and to those populations that normally wouldn't have access to that. And I think that the art community really needs to wake up and understand that it's not always about those individuals that have been educated or from a social economic tier that can enjoy or get something out of it, or that can bring something to the table. I mean, when I curate my work, I team up seasoned, very, very, very well seasoned artists with first-time exhibitors. I get a lot of flack for that, but for me, I'm trying to tell a story. So the story can be told by many different artists from different levels, because it's not about the quality of for me anyways, it's not about the quality or the level of the artist, but it's about telling that story. So you can tell that story in very simple ways, which we've seen with a lot of these pieces, or with a lot of pieces like Antoine's, which are very layered, and there's, you know, so I think that this way of doing things is going to open up more opportunities. But I just hope that we don't lose the ability to actually see the physical works, because I think that that's super important. Because you're just not going to be able to appreciate the layers, the textures, the size, the simplicity of the work than by seeing it in person. And I think that that's going to be important. But when I go to a museum or to see work, I typically go by myself. So I like the social distancing because I want to shut everything off. I want to stand in front of the piece. I want to just absorb it. I want to study it. And it takes me a long time when I'm looking at a piece to really understand it. And I may view a piece 3 and 4 times before I get something from it. Sometimes I'll see a piece and I'm like, nah, I don't see it. And I talk to a colleague and they'll say, oh, but did you get this or did you get that? And then I have to go back. And a lot of it has to do with my frame of mind, where I am in my personal life, you know, what's happening in my world. And I think that viewing things from the comfort of your home is great because there's a convenience for that. But I think we really have to find a way to get people into the museums, into the galleries, into these community spaces, because that's really what it's about. It's about that engagement. It's about that community. It's about that connection that we can make through the arts and by telling these stories.
Yeah, I want, as we wrap up here, I want Leah and then Anna to speak to what you just said about the importance of seeing physical work and actually being able to take it in that way. Leah, you go first, and then Anna.
Yeah, I would agree with what everyone has said so far about, I think there's been some really great innovations. We've been able to think very quickly on our feet and make things accessible. Those things should continue in tandem. I think there's just no substitute for being able to be in the galleries, be in the museums, all the things that Rafael said about scale of work and texture and all of those things are so important. I mean, working at an academic institution, right when all this happened and we started putting things in place for virtual artist talks and what kind of finishing up our programming in virtual ways, I was like, we should be doing this all the time. I think maybe, right? I think there are some things that won't translate well in the future and that they maybe just need to only be in person, or other ways of finding other ways of making them accessible, because I think we will start getting Zoom fatigue. There's only certain things you could do in Zoom, right? So, but we as an academic institution, we have this whole audience of alumni that don't live nearby, and it's been really great for them. It's been like an amazing way for us to connect with them, you know, with the galleries specifically and the programming. So I think they have to work in tandem. I think that museums and galleries will be able to open sooner and implement like the physical distancing kind of things we need to do easier than some of the other arts, right? Unfortunately, I think our friends in theater and dance and music will have a little bit harder time. So I don't know. I hope there's ways for us to kind of collaborate with other folks and be able to offer more arts things in a safer way soon.
Yeah, Anna, I think that Leah brings up an interesting point about it being safe. So an institution like Artspace, when we are transitioning back into being able to be together, what are some of the precautions or steps that institutions should be taking as we lean into that?
Well, I think it forces us to think more creatively and let go of some sort of staid traditions, like in Raleigh and communities across the country. Visual arts centers rely on things like First Friday, you know, or there's the traditional artist opening, and there's this big sort of unveiling and a big group of people comes to see it, whereas the way in which we've really been interacting with people over the last few months is through sort of smaller digestible snippets. And I think that's one way in which we're thinking about, you know, when we do get to a point where we reopen beyond the sort of logistical reality of hand sanitizer and, you know, the stuff, things like that, thinking about, rather than having like a big to do, having things that might interest different people, multiple events. So maybe bringing in a musician that speaks to something that's happening in the show, having a small artist talk, you know, and on and on and on and on, and continuing to do things digitally. I mean, I would say my eyes have very much been open through this experience to the really valuable resource we've had in front of us for years, and I don't think have utilized, just because, you know, there is no substitution for seeing works in person. I don't think anyone would argue that, but there are ways in which you can reach more people. You can have substantive conversations. You can have fun online with people. That allows that distancing that's become necessary right now. And so yeah, I think there's a number of ways that'll continue.
I wish we had more time to continue this discussion, and maybe we'll do a part 2, but we want to thank everybody for joining us. Rafael, Alexys, Leah, and Susan, thank you for joining us. Thank you for participating in this. Thank you to all the artists that are a part of Fresh. You know, it's a really great exhibition, as Anna mentioned, and it features more than 250 work. So everybody go online, go to Artspace's website and check it out. Anna, what are the details about when the exhibition ends and how people can purchase?
Yeah. Oh, thank you. Good. Because I was going to say, I never mentioned anything about purchasing. So works can be viewed online. Initially, the end date was May 31st, so it was through the end of this month, but we've actually just today decided to extend that through June 26th, which would have been the closing of the live juried show had that taken place. So people can visit the Fresh virtual show on our website, artspacenc.org. Within the Fresh link, which is right there on our homepage, you can access the Curator pages in the upper right. There's a drop down. It's real bare bones, simple. Purchasing happens just online through a Buy It Now button. And if you're uncomfortable sharing, you know, putting your credit card online, I know there's still people who feel that way. you call us up at Artspace and we can facilitate a sale Monday through Friday, 9 to 5. There's someone there at the front desk answering the phones. We are, as I'd mentioned before, this show started as a fundraiser for Artspace. This year it's functioning as a fundraiser for North Carolina artists, as well as Artspace's scholarship fund and education fund. And so Artspace retains 30% of all sales, 70% goes straight to the artists. So it's a really great way to support both of those causes. And I mean, as everyone's mentioned, our North Carolina artists kick ass, y'all, and they are hurting right now. And I am so grateful for everyone who's already purchased. I would say at this point, at least 75% of sales are by artists. Artists are buying the work of their peers. So anyone who's watching right now, I'd ask you to consider, if you've got a little extra, there's no better cause, and you end up with a fabulous work of art.
All right, well, you heard it straight from the director of artistic programs herself. Go to artspacenc.org, check out the Fresh exhibition. Big shout out to all of the artists, and big shout out to our curators conversation today. Thank you all for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.